Now let's jump into our history section for this unit. We're going to talk about some key leaders who started what are generally termed the holiness churches. They didn't use that terminology originally, though that was certainly a major factor in their focus from the beginning, in light of seeing how the Methodist church that they had been part of were becoming increasingly co-opted by society, and what they saw as a moving away from the revivalistic and holiness and counter-cultural aspects of John Wesley's early movement. So we begin with Orange Scott. He was the key founder of the Wesleyan Methodist Church, which is now called the Wesleyan Church. We got into the combination of that in 1968 with the Pilgrim Holiness Church. He was born in 1800 in Vermont, the oldest of 8 kids. His father was a day laborer, and they were a poor family, as day laborers often are. His father worked jobs that he could have among various landowners in the area, but that's not a way to make wealth. He and his brothers went to work when little boys, so he really had this only a sporadic education. And again, another illustration of how some early Methodist leaders really came from a broad range of backgrounds and experience and education that helped form the movement. In 1820, he was convicted of sin while working in a field. He immediately kneeled and prayed to God. The following month, he accepted Jesus at a Methodist camp meeting and joined the Methodist Episcopal Church. He soon after became a minister. He served as a circuit rider for years, a presiding elder for 6 years, and a delegate at the General Conference. So he not only became a minister, he was clearly showing skill in leadership and a lot of other ways that helped him rise quickly in the Methodist Episcopal Church. However, in 1833, he became passionately interested in the abolitionist movement. In 1834, he wrote his first article against slavery and lectured on abolitionism throughout the region of Cincinnati. In 1836, he was removed from his position as a presiding elder precisely because of his views on abolition. He was among many other Methodists who were disciplined in one way or another by the Methodist bishops, the hierarchy, because they would not be silent. In the meetings, they actually prevented any abolitionist discussions, especially from those who were leaders in churches in the South did not want anyone from the North to interfere. They did not want to cause problems or chaos, and so they just did not allow these discussions to take place. Though they did allow pro-slavery people to talk at the general conferences. In 1836 and 1840, he took a stand at the Methodist General Conference, part of a strong anti-slavery contingent, but these were very strongly pushed against and, as I said, silent. In 1842, he, along with some other ministers, formally withdrew from the Methodist Church, as they saw that abolitionists were being formally silenced so as to maintain the growth and influence that these churches were having in the South. It's hard to stay popular if you're alienating a good many of your parishioners. And so rather than alienating the parishioners, the leaders of the Methodist Church in the South decided to be silent on slavery, whatever views they personally had, and certainly they were mixed. There was also some pro-slavery leaders within the hierarchy that were actively opposing Orange Scott and others. Scott and others, these are all worthwhile names, so I'm only featuring some representatives of them, so don't feel like I'm intentionally leaving anyone out, but we only have so much time. They published their reasons in a new magazine that they called The True Wesleyan, and as we discussed in an earlier unit, Wesley's view on slavery were not themselves quiet. They were not subtle. He was very strongly against slavery. He was very strongly against racism. So what they were arguing for is that they were not separating from the Methodist Church, but the Methodist Church had separated from Wesley's own views. In early 1843, they invited other ministers and lay people to talk about forming a new church that was, quote, free from episcopacy and slavery. Scott wanted a, quote, a new anti-slavery, anti-intemperance, anti-everything wrong church organization. Woohoo! The opposition to episcopacy developed from the seeming dictatorial attitude of the Methodist bishops in silencing abolitionist perspectives. So they saw that the episcopacy as the main barrier to making change within the church, and because a small number of leaders had power to control who spoke, it silenced a movement within the church that was really much more popular than the indications may have led others to believe. In 1844, then, the Wesleyan Methodist Connection was born, and I already talked about the meaning of the term connection. In 1861, they officially supported ordaining women, starting with Mary Well. she was officially ordained. This has been a practice ever since. She was not the first ordained woman. However, we can see in the Wesleyan Methodist connection, now the Wesleyan Church, a consistent commitment to ordaining women from 1860. So we might be able to say this is the earliest ordination that has thus continued without a break. Orrin Scott died in 1847 at age 47, so relatively young, and others stepped in leadership. But he helped create this momentum, and his passion and his eagerness created this groundswell that helped orient a new kind of church community that sought to go back to what Wesley's own views were on important social issues and key themes. Luther Lee, who had joined with Orrin Scott in helping start that new denomination, but had some different emphases and experiences and trajectories. He was born in 1800. He died in 1889. His parents were farmers. His father was a Revolutionary War veteran, so coming out of a different class. His mother became a Methodist when he was young. So at age 8, he made his own personal commitment to Christ. She died when he was 13. In 1827, he became an itinerant minister with the Methodist Church. He was a circuit rider, serving northern New York, became known as a popular camp meeting preacher and public debater on theology topics. In fact, he was such a good debater and so clear and orderly in his discussions, he had earned the nickname Logical Lee. In 1837, a Presbyterian minister named Elijah Lovejoy was murdered by a mob in Alton, Illinois, on account of his anti-slavery work. The news of this led this young Methodist preacher named Luther Lee to a strong shift in his priorities, and he became a fervent abolitionist from that point on. He became a key conductor, as they called them, on the Underground Railroad in his home of Fulton, New York, and helped about 30 slaves a month find their way to freedom. So it wasn't just talk. He was actually taking risks and being active in his pursuits. He had a diverse congregation in Fulton, and later on in his congregation in Syracuse. He was one of the key leaders who then formed the Wesleyan Church, formally in 1843 at their convention in Utica, New York. In 1848, he hosted the Women's Rights Convention at his church in Utica and preached the ordination service for Antoinette Brown in 1853. She was a Congregationalist, not a Wesleyan Methodist, but could find no one to lend public support for her ordination except for Lee, formal pastoral support, that is. In his sermon on Galatians 3:28 for this ordination service, Lee noted that he had not thought about a woman's ordination very much before, but based on his study, he could find no reason not to affirm it. He was a key leader in the denomination after Orrin Scott died in 1847, and he was the presiding officer, the president of the connection at 3 of the first 6 general conferences. He was considered the intellectual of the group of leaders. He's seen as the denomination's first real systematic theologian and have published on these topics. However, in 1867, after the Civil War ended, he returned to the Methodist Episcopal Church for the rest of his ministry career, again showing how there's a unifying tendency among Wesleyan traditions. He saw that the division that had ruptured over the cause of slavery was no longer an issue as he saw it, so he returned to the denomination. As we know, of course, just because slavery ended did not mean the end of these discussions, and racism and other things continued to develop, but that was not as clearly seen. There was a lot more hope for moving forward in the late 1860s. Benjamin Roberts, another of the key holiness leaders. He was born in 1823 in western New York. He died in 1893. He was well educated and eager in his education. He served as a school teacher beginning at age 16. He studied to be a lawyer. In 1844, just as he was going to pass the bar exam, he changed course. He heard a testimony shared by a poor tradesman. It led him to this awareness of Christ in his life, and something illuminated his understanding and put him on a brand new path. He pursued ministry studies at Wesleyan University. He graduated, was ordained, and was given a pastorate in New York. But there were growing tensions in his experience as a Methodist minister, just as there were with Luther Lee and Orrin Scott and so many others. Even early on, he was convinced by the abolitionist cause, and he also became increasingly aware of how wealth was influencing the church and was becoming a corrupting factor in people's lives and a dividing factor among the church people, where rich people were being treated better and poor people treated worse, and there were these divisions in even how a church service was laid out. By the early 1850s, specific issues actually became formed out of this, become dominant in his mind and in the experience of the Methodists, focusing on the pew system, where people bought seats in church. So one way of tithing was you contributed your pew rent. You bought seats. The best seats, which were farther forward and more prominent, were more expensive. This discriminated against the poor and made the church yet another bought and paid for element of society, just like the rest. Now we can go back to 1 Corinthians and see how Paul responded to that issue in regards to the Eucharist. He didn't think that was something people should do. And so combined with a strong rejection of slavery, he made increasing stands against the established leaders of his district. They brought charges against him for unchristian and immoral conduct because he was standing against the church hierarchy. He stood against the establishment. He was found guilty with his ordination removed. In 1860, he and others who shared his concerns started what's called the Free Methodist Church, as they were free from slavery, secret orders, worldliness in dress, and rigid formality in public worship. He was also a very strong supporter of the ordination of women. And we end with this conclusion of his book, Ordaining Women. What are we? What our race? How good for nothing and base, without fair woman to aid us? What could we do? Where should we go? How should we wander in night and woe, but for women to lead us? This is how the quote from his chapter from Cristobal de Castillejo from 1590. In the preceding pages, the following propositions have been clearly proved. So this is his summary, a good conclusion, a good reminder of how to structure an essay, a hint, hint. In the preceding pages, the following propositions have been clearly proved. Man and woman were created equal, each possessing the same rights and privileges as the other. At the fall, woman, because she was first in the transgression, was, as a punishment, made subject to her husband. 3. Christ reenacted the primitive law and restored the original relation of equality of the sexes. 4. The objections to the equality of man and woman in the Christian church, based upon the Bible, rest upon a wrong translation of some passages and a misinterpretation of others. The objections drawn from woman's nature are fully overthrown by undisputed facts. 5. In the New Testament church, woman, as well as man, filled the office of apostle, prophet, deacon, or preacher and pastor. There is not the slightest evidence that the functions of any of these offices when filled by a woman were different from what they were when filled by a man. Woman took part in governing the apostolic church. We come then to this final conclusion, all caps. The gospel of Jesus Christ, in the provisions which it makes and in the agencies which it employs for the salvation of mankind, knows no distinction of race, condition, or sex. Therefore, no person evidently called of God to the gospel ministry and duly qualified for it should be refused ordination on account of race, condition, or sex. With this, we end the discussion on ecclesiology with this very Wesleyan perspective on ministry and mission that helps shape the discussions that continue in our era. But you can see, even in this early time, mid-1800s, this yearning for equality and for the Spirit's work to be made evident. It's not by rejecting the Bible, but by embracing the Bible, embracing the mission, embracing the work of Christ in full, and seeing this as a new life, a new birth that's given to all people, which creates into us a new kind of people, no longer reflecting the patterns of society that tends towards restriction around us. And that continues to be our mission wherever we are.